Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this week's Friday lecture. This event is co-organized by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the Archaeology Brown Bag series of the Department of Anthropology. And before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Now, today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Mark Alves. Dr. Alves is a professor at Montgomery College in Maryland and is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Southeast Asian Linguistic Society. He has published widely on historical and comparative linguistics of Southeast Asia with a focus on Vietnamese and the Austroasiatic language family. His dozens of publications have explored regional language contact in Greater Southeast Asia, typological linguistics, especially morphology and Austroasiatic, loanwords, especially Sino-Vietnamese and regional Chinese loanwords, ethnohistorical linguistics, including matters of metallurgy and metal implements, household objects and activities, domesticated birds, color terms, kinship terms, grammatical words, among other categories. His research agenda has increasingly incorporated an interdisciplinary approach involving linguistic, historical, textual, archaeological, and ethnographic data. Let's give a warm welcome for Dr. Mark Alves.
So hi, everyone. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to be present for this event of the Southeast Asian Studies and Department of Anthropology, though it's online, of course. It's better than nothing, and this approach is efficient and generally effective, I think. Let me start by saying I assume that my audience includes anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians primarily, but not historical linguists. So I've crafted my talk accordingly. My goal is to share information to encourage attention to what historical linguistic data and insights can offer to research in ethnohistory, ethnoarchaeology. Archaeologists sometimes refer to language families, and there is some attention to linguistic data in publications in archaeological literature. I think it's kind of limited, and I think there could and should be more. This is especially the case now, 2022, with huge linguistic data sources and digital tools to sift that data. Please note, however, that when I'm talking, I'm going to have a lot of underlying assumptions. For example, technical issues of historical phonology or criteria for establishing etymological origins. I don't have time to explain all of them. So you'll undoubtedly sometimes think, on what basis did he claim that? Well, feel free to ask questions at the end of my talk. Okay. To start, how come? There we go. Give you a little bit, describe my research and publishing background. You heard some of it before, but I'm going to give you my perspective and show aspects of historical linguistics. Now, there's a good deal of ethnohistorical research in historical linguistics in mainland Southeast Asia. I'm not the first person, of course, but I'm bringing to the table of mainland Southeast Asian research, so updates in linguistic data and methods of utilizing that data. Okay, I'm a linguist. I primarily focused on historical and comparative linguistics in the region. So my publications here start with, of course, general historical linguistics, historical phonology and syntax, which is probably less interesting to you, but is probably more useful than you realize. Loanwords, language contact, grammaticalization. And then, as mentioned before, cultural and semantic domains. So when I'm looking at words for trade items, agriculture, food production, these very recognizable kinship terms and color terms, right? That's anthropological stuff. Again, I'm not an anthropologist. Early Chinese loanwords. And when I say early, I mean basically the first millennium CE, primarily in Vietnamese, but also broader Southeast Asia, because there are a lot of languages, and I'll talk about that, you will see. And the impact, of course, is both sociocultural and linguistic through that kind of contact. right? Vietic vocabulary, and Vietic you recognize, you think Vietnamese, but it's not just Vietnamese, a lot of other languages. This is the ancestral language and reconstructing certain aspects. I've published some on this. I've got another article that's just about to be published for the Damsan culture. Now, evidence of Austroasiatic etymologies, and I'll give you more about language families and such in a couple of minutes. So, evidence of Southeast Asian sociocultural contact from the contact with these incoming ethno-linguistic groups. Okay, and so you'll see that list of language groups there. I will briefly introduce these to make sure that everybody's there. Up to this. And here's some of my publications and videos on this sort of thing. So these are the kinds of research agendas that will allow me to present hypothetical past ethnolinguistic scenarios. Okay. A couple of last thoughts on my approach. I am not an archaeologist, nor am I a historian. So when I use such data, I look for widespread consensus on topics in those disciplines. I try to work with the consensus ideas and views, okay? I'm not going to make decisions on that. I sometimes consult archaeologists and historians to make sure that I have presented those ideas in an acceptable way. Also, my approach is data-driven. I am not trying to create a narrative. I look at it, as much data as I can, apply analytical tools, try to find out what the best data is revealing, and there can be, various hypotheses. So, and finally, I do my best to acknowledge where I cannot make claims based on the limits of the data, or where aspects are just unknown and unknowable. So that's my approach as I'm presenting things today. Okay. All right. Now I've talked about my research in historical linguistics. Let me present a few more details about what's involved in historical linguistics. Okay. What is historical linguistics? Well, it covers anything that is in linguistics. So phonology, morphology, syntax. You can see the list here. And okay, that's fine. What does it entail? Well, we have to use data sources for historical linguistics, and it's a mixture of descriptions of modern languages, descriptions of past languages, of course, historical texts, epigraphs, and such, and various lexical resources. Okay, fine. And then the historical linguistic approach, comparative method, that is very important, and that has a long history. Well, if you want to consider 150 or so years long. And we seek systematic, notice that word systematic is emphasized, patterns in the various types of linguistic data. And we do this to reconstruct past words and the linguistic systems, right? This is linguistics, not culture, right? Reconstructing past words, reconstructing linguistic systems, and to hypothesize their origins and diachronic development. So I've just given you, in 2 minutes, a book's worth of information. All right, and obviously I can't explain everything. The bottom line here, there's a long tradition in historical linguistics with an analytical approach. And in many ways, these pure linguistic studies, as you can, I hope you can see that it does involve the scientific method. We can't do carbon dating, right? No, there are no time machines, but we can't even do carbon dating, but we can provide relative chronologies, which can then be clarified, I think, by archaeological and historical data. And so there'll be examples of this later in my talk. Okay. So while historical linguistics covers a wide range of aspects of human language, I'm going to focus on etymology and the history of words. Words represent objects. Words represent concepts, right? So that certainly historians and archaeologists like those things. And historical linguistics can explore the past by considering words, especially reconstructed words of proto-languages. And I will, again, more examples to come, but this is the important part. The proto-language reconstructions are very significant. I want to emphasize that I don't just consider single words. This is not enough. I consider broader cultural domains and semantic systems. This becomes a much more effective tool, as I show. If you just look at single words, you can't establish a pattern from a single word, obviously. And even 2 words, not quite enough. So what etymological research involves is identifying lexical retentions, lexical innovations, or lexical borrowings. Retentions from those proto-languages, lexical innovations at later stages, and then borrowings from other language groups. Sounds a little bit like sociocultural contact, doesn't it, right? We can talk about the same thing with sociocultural contact, but now we're looking at words. Now, what can etymology do? What it cannot do for archaeohistorical research? It can offer insights into inferences about the past, but only when relevant words exist in the data. That's a limit, right? No words, we don't have it. That's it. It provides a point of reference for timing and chronology, but that generally requires extra linguistic data. And when I say extra linguistic, I mean, basically the historical and archaeological types of data and ethnographic data. How historical and archaeological research feeds into my etymological research, and not just mine, others too. Of course, historical textual information is very useful. Excavated material culture, oh man, the archaeological publications help so much. And implied associated cultural practices. Carbon dating is always, we love carbon dating, yes, with some numbers that give us some control over what we're hypotheses, or at least leading to hypotheses. However, let's turn it around. How archaeological research could benefit from historical linguistic data. Lexical evidence in proto-language reconstructions matching archaeohistorical hypotheses. Okay, I'll talk about that a little bit today. Loanword history and implied sociocultural contact or developments, right? Implied. This is another way of looking at sociocultural contact in the past. Words from tangible culture that are not in the archaeological or historical records. So I think this is something to be aware of, and now please note that sometimes the archaeological and historical data don't correspond to the linguistic data. Sometimes the data just doesn't match. Okay, I will not give examples of that. I'll give you the good ones. But I have seen plenty of other instances in which I do see questions that arise from the linguistic data. So questions itself, I hope the questions can give archaeologists and ethnohistorians directions of inquiry, maybe places that they might otherwise not see. Okay. Oops. Okay, so oops. All right, let's move on. Let me give you a sense of the geographic region I have in mind for the linguistic data I'll present today. This map shows the complex layering of language groups, and of course, these colored blobs mask even more linguistic complexity, right? So the lines don't, in some ways, the lines are meaningless, right? People move around and it's a lot more complicated than this. There are, generally accepted, there are 5 language families in the region, right? There's a lot of language families in a relatively small area. All of the modern languages, though, have dozens of languages, sometimes several dozen languages spoken in them. The national languages in them are often lingua franca, but like these colored blobs, that kind of hides the linguistic complexity. The long-term mixing has created a situation in which various language groups share many typological features, and I mean linguistic features. Due to that long-term contact, it's what we call typological convergence. That situation is also complex. You can't generalize and say they're all the same because they are not. But there is contact that resulted in convergence throughout the region. So we can see from this map information about complex sociocultural mixture, and also reveals something about the history of language groups in the region. And I'll talk about these in the next 4 slides. Okay. Now, I know that you know those language family names, but I just better do a quick review since I'll refer to these in discussing the language history in the region. Austroasiatic, we think of Khmer and Vietnamese, but except for those 2, there are just over 100 other languages. That's quite a number, isn't it? 13 branches, groups, right? 13 branches within this in mainland Southeast Asia and Eastern India. And it's been generally demonstrated through archaeological literature that has the longest presence in mainland Southeast Asia. Now, I'm going to talk about something before, but not yet here. because that's the longest presence of existing languages in the region, as opposed to the ones that are not there now. Kradai, sometimes called Thai Kadai, and I'll be focusing on the Dai branch. The Dai branch, we think of Zhuang, Thai, Lao, several dozen other languages in southern China. Mainland Southeast Asia, Austronesian, oh goodness, about 1,000 languages throughout the Asia-Pacific region, all the way to Madagascar, but we're going to focus on Malayo-Chamic languages. So we think of Malay, Indonesian, Cham, but there are about a dozen others and various dialects. Sino-Tibetan, sometimes called Trans-Himalayan, if you want to adopt some new jargon. Focusing on Sinitic, I will be focusing primarily on Sinitic, and Chinese is a problematic term. I'm going to use the term Sinitic to separate that, and just Sinitic is the group of languages, group of related languages that we call Chinese often in a very unclear way. And then Tibeto-Burman languages, which are, just a few hundred other languages. Oh goodness, it's again, lots of languages, aren't there? Lastly, Hmong-Mien, and a few other dozen languages in southern China and northern. So I want to emphasize one thing. Just keep in mind the modern languages are as different from their ancestral languages as two unrelated languages today. Okay, that is, it's not really logical to speak of Vietnamese 2,000 years ago or Thai 2,000 years ago. They weren't the same languages, right? I'm not an archaeologist, but I think it's like saying humans from 2 million years ago, because the ancestors weren't yet humans, so don't fall into the conceptual trap of thinking of the ancestral proto-languages being the same as their modern language descendants. Okay, they're completely what we call mutual intelligibility. There would be none, just like there is with modern English versus Old English, if you've ever looked at those. Okay, all right. So for those 5 language families, there are huge amounts of linguistic data, and more than ever before, most of it digitized. I'll briefly show samples later in my talk of some of the data. And from the historical linguistic data, we can gain chronological insights, okay? But this requires a mixture of linguistic data and other sources. So from this extra linguistic data, everything of archaeological data, historical records, ethnohistory, modern ethnography. We look, of course, at dates of texts and epigraphs. The earliest attestations of words can give us a point of reference. It doesn't mean that was when the word was invented. It means that it was used prior to that time at some unknown period, right? Chinese, of course, but throughout the region, there are plenty of old texts that can be checked, and a lot of it's digitized, so we can check those things now. As for linguistics, relative chronology, not absolute chronology, relative chronology via language features. So reconstructed words, linguistic elements and systems. So we have the reconstructions. We identify changes in speech sounds, morphology and such. So once we get to that, we've got these 2 points of reference: reconstructed words sometime in the past, changes sometime in the past, right? So we have our relative chronology, okay? As for those lexical reconstructions, the 2 categories that I think of are important: original proto-language forms, such as true Proto-Austroasiatic word forms, or those which are really from Old Chinese, not later stage regionally spread words. Right? We can determine this to some extent by geography and phonological features, and that's something that would take too much time to cover. So this is dense, I know, but as you can see, there is a rich variety of means of getting insights into chronology from linguistic data. So now that I've introduced language families in the region and some issues of historical linguistic concepts and chronology, I'm going to jump in with ideas about the history of these languages in mainland Southeast Asia to provide some context for other hypotheses I'll present later in the talk. These waves of incoming language groups are what has led to these colorful blobs on that map a few slides back. So, okay, this is what I was talking about before. Prior to 4,000 years before present, Wabinian period, there's really no evidence of any of those languages prior to that period. the Negrito groups in Malaysia and the Philippines, they speak other languages. They don't speak a separate language. And in mainland Southeast Asia, I have not seen any evidence of them. So we begin with Proto-Austroasiatic. Okay. At this point, the spread of Neolithic agriculturalists and the two-layer hypothesis, per Bellwood, Hayam, Matsumura, others, from the bordering southern China into mainland Southeast Asia. It's about 4,000 years before present, and I will be touching on that again later. So when we don't think of, where does Austrasiatic come from, I just think about, well, when did it disperse and from approximately where? That's the best we can do. So this Proto-Austrasiatic dispersal into mainland Southeast Asia. Tai Kadai again, primarily in southern China until about the first millennium CE, but I think this is murky, and I don't know all of, people are going to argue about it. But at the very least, we have the Indianized Thai kingdoms that really begin in the second millennium, largely. I don't, again, I'm not the historian expert, but I believe that to be about accurate. So the Dai groups are somewhat later in mainland Southeast Asia proper. Okay, Sinitic. They're thinking of the Han Dynasty southward expansion into northern Vietnam, about 2000 BCE, periodic Chinese migrations into mainland Southeast Asia in subsequent centuries. So we've got another period, about 4,000 years ago, about 2,000 years ago, about 1,000 years ago. Okay, broad strokes. Then we have the Austroasiatic branches, and we can start to talk more about Indianized, right? Yeah, so-called Indianized Khmer and Mon kingdoms, although a little bit later, the Sinicized Viet Minh. Okay, so we've got different groups, more language contact, and I know that this is generally considered to be historical and archaeological, but giving a little linguistic angle to it. Malayo-Chamic, primarily central and southern Vietnam, possible connection with Sahuan culture from the first millennium BCE. And I don't know that anybody can prove or disprove that. And I think that's going to be debatable, and connected by texts to the Indianized Linyi, Champa, and Malayo kingdoms. That's different. When there's textual data that looks like Malay and Cham, then we feel more confident about them, at least in the last 1,500 years or so. I think it's a little bit older for the Cham. Tibeto-Burman Indianized Pew Kingdom from the early first millennium, that's and Pagan Kingdom into the second millennium. And Viet Minh, there is again maintained up in northern Vietnam until about the mid-second millennium, especially after the fall of the Champa Kingdom. The Hmong Mien comes rather late in the second millennium, and I don't know of specific dates, but I won't have much to say about that. But the other groups, yes, a little bit more. So, oops, I clicked that by mistake. So overall, Austroasiatic groups were followed by waves of other ethno-linguistic groups with sharing of lexical material, convergence of typological features, and many uncertainties remain about times and locations of sociocultural and linguistic contact. Okay, so, whew, okay. This is dense, okay. This is a highly simplified overview of tremendously complex ethno-linguistic history, obviously. Still, I'm pretty sure the overall ideas are reasonably well supported. It gives us a point of reference, at least, for working hypotheses for these things, but it shows how we can combine a linguistic perspective to the discussion. So the history of language families broadly in the region can be connected with historical periods. Okay, the history of language families can be connected with these historical periods. So this sets us up for more focus on the lexical data and issues. So what can I do with this data in gathering and evaluating this? Okay, number one, find data for as many languages as possible, of course. So I'm going to show you a sample. I'm going to use the word weave. This is the Mon Khmer Etymological Dictionary, and I'm going to type in the word weave. Oops, if I can do it properly. There we go. And let's see, move this down a little bit while it's getting There we go. And so we find 683 items that are related, that have the entries that have weave. And you can see these are almost all of the branches. This is a what's called a Khmer etymological reconstruction thing. And you can see there that reconstruction. And then you go to Aslian and Aslian in Malaysia, and we go, oh, there's a thing there, apparently. And then I'm going to go to Khmeric, and I go down here. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Tabang, which is, they had a little infix there. And I won't explain what that means. And let's see, Nicobar, that's in the islands, the Nicobar Islands, and Tangya. Oh, okay. And then I'm going to go to Vietic. And though there's a Proto-Vietic form Tang and Bahnaric Tang. So I think we can say with some confidence that this weaving, plating, was part of Austroasiatic. It was an Austroasiatic, Proto-Austroasiatic word. Okay, so, and I'm not just looking at one, and I'm looking at a lot, and I'm going to compare the forms, and I'm going to find patterns as much as I can. Okay. And we're going to use other lexical digital sources as well for effective sifting. I'm going to choose the word basket, and I'm going to try it. I'm going to do it in Vietnamese and basket. And so you think, oh, well, I'll just get one word, I'll just find what basket means. And in this one, it's going to give me a little bit more here. And there we go. And so, oh, I've got a bamboo basket, and I've got a basket with a boken coop, and I've got a winnowing basket. Okay, all kinds of things. This is what we need to check. Now, this is for Vietnamese. I can check all of the Southeast Asian languages in the region. Okay, so this has a bunch of minority languages as well as national languages. This has others, as you can see, a lot of data, and that's just for Austroasiatic, and then these are others that are not for Austroasiatic other language families. Okay. Lexical reconstructions. So we want to focus on those reconstructions that I just showed you, like Tang for weave, for a wide geographic range, deep time depth, but be aware of the basis of reconstructions. We don't have to accept them, but at some point when the data is so overwhelming, you have a hard time saying, well, I don't know, how could it possibly be Tang if all of them have Tang? Oh, well, that including the languages that are not in mainland Southeast Asia. Recurring patterns, seek consistent historical phonological patterns and logically consistent semantics to avoid excessive power. And so for me, this is a crucial tool to exclude hypotheses. I'm not just looking to include, I want to exclude claims. That is very important. Questions to me, questions of chronology, when possible, identify relative chronology, potential depth of etyma. Okay, so for example, is it Proto-Austroasiatic, 4000 BP? Is it a later stage sub-branch level? Maybe evidence during one of the Khmer kingdoms, okay? Later stage loanwords from Chinese, that sort of thing. And we can have working hypotheses on these. So categories of lexical data to consider. With all that available lexical data, we can consider a variety of types, and some of them are more informative than others. But when I'm presenting some data, we think of basic vocabulary, okay? Body parts, natural phenomena. For historical linguists, this is important for establishing phonological patterns because, of course, these are the kinds of words that are less likely to be borrowed, right? We don't need archaeological evidence to prove that people had noses, obviously, right? And that people looked at the sky, right? Natural phenomena and such. But there are words for material culture commonly available in the archaeological record, things made with stone, ceramic, metal objects, and that sort of thing. But there are words for material culture not available or rarely available in the archaeological record. Woven materials, hard to get sometimes in mainland Southeast Asia, clothing, cuisine. Words for intangible concepts, verbs, adjectives, and grammatical words. Obviously, you cannot get these from an archaeological excavation, and probably not from textual data most of the time either. It's certainly not Chinese descriptions of them. Note, while all types of words can be borrowed, this is a caveat, all types of words can be borrowed, hypothetically. Linguistic research has repeatedly shown that basic vocabulary tends to be retained much longer and more frequently, and is less likely to be borrowed. Culturally specific, non-core vocabulary, especially terms for trade items, that kind of vocabulary is more likely to be borrowed. Okay, I'll show exactly that, and you'll see how that goes. Okay, now it's time to start considering what specific linguistic data can tell us. As I mentioned, the hypothesis is that Austroasiatic is the oldest existing language family in modern Southeast Asia, at least going back 4,000 years, probably more is what it looks like. That makes Austroasiatic languages and the Austroasiatic etymology is very central to mainland Southeast Asian language history. Okay, it's sort of like they were there continuously. Everyone else came in later. That's it. For this data, I take a pretty strict approach, and I focus again on basic vocabulary, higher chance of long-term retention, and of course, higher chance. No absolutes. There are no time machines. Or probable terms of early Austroasiatic culture, probable words of early Austroasiatic culture. Is, again, less likely to have been borrowed, but like that word thang, okay? Recurring phonological correspondences to indicate cognacy. This is really important. If we don't have these correspondences, we don't have support. We have to reject those hypothesized claims of common origin. Lexical attestations in at least several branches. I mentioned 13 branches, at least several branches of Proto-Austroasiatic, including branches outside of or peripheral to mainland Southeast Asia. So the Munda languages, Munda is one language, but Mundic languages in India, Nicobar and the Nicobar Islands, we assume early separation. The details are murky, but they are definitely not in contact with mainland Southeast Asia. So they didn't borrow words by trade unless there's evidence of that. So this high bar increases the likelihood that the etyma I'm going to talk about have a deep history in Austroasiatic from before the 4000 BP dispersal. Okay, so this is what we're looking at. I'm trying to get as strict as possible. And so the first type will be words of the natural environment. And these are, I'm not going to provide you the phonetic reconstructions. I'll show you some phonetic reconstructions. It's just, you just need to understand the implications of it. These are the meanings of these Proto-Austroasiatic etyma. What's necessary is just the word meanings for now. Okay, so we have words for nature, and good, we expect that, things like rain and earth and sand and water. Words for animals, okay. I've put dog in red because that's of course domesticated, and so that's more interesting, and that matches up with the archaeological literature. Words for sun or day, moon or month, and year, and so tiny bit of cultural aspect here, and then various descriptions. Okay, well, the words for the natural environment are not very informative about culture. Okay, but such vocabulary establishes a phonological baseline. Research has shown again that words like these are less likely to be borrowed. There's not sociocultural reasons for it, and are more likely to have been retained. So we have higher confidence of their retention even from 4,000 years plus. And these forms then become, it's a foundation for phonological reconstructions of words, sometimes other details. Okay, but beyond the natural environment, we have Proto-Austroasiatic etyma for the human experience, and just you can see here kinship terms. Good, that's interesting. Pronouns, and you don't normally think of those in archaeological reconstructions. Parts of the body, fine. Actions related to the body, lie down and sleep, those sorts of things. So I haven't gotten a complete list for kinship terms for Proto-Austroasiatic, so we have some that are of note, but there are obviously gaps. So I can't present a complete picture, say what kind of kinship system Proto-Austroasiatic had. Work on it later. These kinds of words, again, help establish a baseline, so it's fine, okay? And some of these words are tested, for example, okay, in both Vietic in Vietnam and Munda in Eastern India. Do you see the words child, you, and bone and bold? Those words are cognate in both Vietnamese and Munda in Eastern India. Okay, so we're looking at pretty deep history in these words. So, of course, what we would like to see is words with more specific cultural focus, right, to provide pieces of a sociocultural picture. And there are some. So let's, hold on here. Okay. First, there are numbers, and reconstructible numbers in Proto-Austroasiatic are somewhat limited. There's kind of a weird situation. I don't have time to discuss the weird situation and their implications of the situation, which I cannot discuss here, but it is significant to not have a full decimal set. Some language families do and some do not. And this is, there are inferences we can make from that, but that's beyond the talk. Now for items for items, okay, for produce and these verbs, I think we can start to see some corroborating evidence of the hypothesized Neolithic agriculturalists in the archaeological literature. We can see parts of homes, right? House, the thatching grass. We can see the key agricultural products, husked rice, very, very significant, millet and paddy and such. The actions related to these, cook in water, to shoot, as in, an arrow, and then that weave word, and to winnow. Okay, so these are not technically basic vocabulary in the classic sense, but apparently these words were of significance, cultural significance, to have been retained in such a large region for potentially 4,000 plus years. I think this both supports current archaeological hypotheses and gives other ideas for other human history queries, really. Yeah. Last note, I haven't provided the phonological reconstructions here, but these are all available online, including the range of languages with attested cognates. So I'm not holding private data. What I'm positing here is something that anyone can check. It's at that website that I was just pointing out. Okay. Okay, now let's jump forward somewhat in time to Proto-Vietic. So Vietic is one of the 13 branches of Austroasiatic. The Vietic branch includes Vietnamese and a few dozen dialectal varieties of what's called Muong. It's not one language, but a group. We don't even know how to divide it into multiple languages, dialects. We'll just call it lects. And then a couple dozen more languages with increasingly archaic linguistic features. And these conservative languages are what we can call less Sinicized and more like other Austroasiatic languages. No time to explain what that means. In this first table of Proto-Vietic words here, okay, related to rice production, I've included those which are also Proto-Austroasiatic Etyma, the PAA forms, okay? So someone else has reconstructed, two different people have reconstructed these two different sets, okay? Two different researchers. So the words are not necessarily, for the Proto-Austroasiatic words, I think these are most likely the 4,000 years before present time depth, but in any case, they're widespread, okay? So we saw husked rice, millet, pestle. That's from the previous slide of those conservatively selected Proto-Austroasiatic Etyma. But these others are also pretty widespread, and so they have considerable depth. So, essentially, these are retentions in Vietic, okay, lexical retentions. Here are more, and these are not in Austroasiatic. So it suggests the possibility, because we can't know if they were lost in all other 12 branches and only retained in Vietic. It's hypothetically impossible, but at the very least, these may be lexical innovations in Vietic at some point after 4,000 BP. Cannot be sure. Right, this is just hypothetical, but those are the possibilities. So now my own working hypothesis about Vietic, consider the beginning of the Bronze Age in northern Vietnam. I think of that maybe as at least it's possible to be associated with Proto-Vietic The archaeological literature shows dates of around 3000 BP for the Bronze Age. I know there's some other dates, but I think that that's the consensus view, and in both in Vietnam and outside. So it's about 1,000 years after the dispersal of Austroasiatic. Bronze Age is associated with cultural developments. These could be mirrored in linguistic development. Could be, you know, hypothetical. That's my working hypothesis. And millennium is enough time for Vietic to become a distinct language, you know, the linguistic speciation, separate from other Austroasiatic languages. Okay, so this has more terms for growing, processing rice and making food. So the data at least raises the possibility that there were other additional sociocultural developments over time. We need more ethnohistorical information, some of which might or might not be available, but the data is here. I'd like to see more corroborating evidence. Next, I'm moving to even later, to around the period beginning of the Common Era. And this is the sort of maybe the center of the Iron Age in southern China, more in Southeast Asia. It's also kind of when silver and gold spread into the region. That, at least that's what I've read in the archaeological literature. Okay, the term Sinosphere for our current purposes means southern China and northern Vietnam. Okay, that's the region where Sinitic, Hmong-Mien, Kradai, and Vietic underwent intense sociocultural and linguistic contact, and this was followed by major restructuring of convergence of word structures in the region. So let's see, let me show you here. Oops, where is that? I'm sorry, hold on one second here. Okay, so current consensus in historical linguistic studies is that, you know, this is something you may not realize. In historical linguistics, that 2,000 years ago, none of these languages had tones. So we're looking at Old Chinese, Middle Chinese, Hmong-Mien, Dai, Vietic, did not have tones 2,000 years ago. They've all been reconstructed by different scholars, both in China and outside of China and in Vietnam and elsewhere. So various linguists, the general consensus, not 100% agreement, but that's the consensus. So, you know, Sinitic was equally affected in contact. Okay, it's hard to explain this, but the idea is the Chinese changed like the other languages changed. Okay, so it's sort of equal influence in terms of the structures of the languages, but the words, that's a different matter. And so words are shared more unidirectionally from Chinese into these others. Okay. So let's see here. So bronze, of course, we're not surprised to see that. Iron and steel, especially innovated in China explicitly. Keep in mind that the Bronze Age sequence begins, to my understanding, farther north in China, and then centuries later in southern China, and then later in northern Vietnam, about 1000 BCE. That's my approximate understanding of the archaeological literature. Maybe you can clarify. The innovation of steel is somewhat later, the West Han Dynasty, so maybe about 2,000 years ago. Okay, but we expect these kinds of words to be borrowed, and sorry, if we see these other words, we expect these others. It's not surprising that gold, silver, and tin would also be borrowed. And these are proto-level language, proto-level forms, so not modern languages. So from what I can see in the literature, gold, silver spread into mainland Southeast Asia in the general period of the Han expansion. That's what I see. So it would seem that Chinese metallurgical practices spread throughout the region. Correspondingly, so did the words. Okay, I've published an article which looked at other words for early Chinese loanwords in Vietnamese, and words such as to forge, those kinds of things. So it seems like it's borrowing of an entire cultural domain. And by the way, both Korean and Japanese also use these Chinese words for metals. So it really emphasizes the impact of Chinese loanwords in the region. And I think this deserves more complete ethnoarchaeological treatment. Anyways, this is a large topic. I better stop. Okay, let me briefly return to the issue of numbers. Okay, a bit of intangible information. Okay, but this will give you another sample of questions. Both Dai and Vietic have borrowed Chinese words for metals, as we just saw. And in fact, proto-Dai numerals from 2 to 10 here. Okay, so the column over there, that's old, OC is Old Chinese, and Dai with those big letters match the so-called tone categories. They're not actually tones, but something else. Okay, so in fact, they've been borrowed, and then from 11 to 99. So basically, Dai languages have borrowed Chinese numerals from 2 to 99, and the number 10,000. Okay, that's rather complete lexical replacement, and it implies heavy language contact. The tone categories match. These are quite old, probably to the Han Dynasty, something like that. In contrast, for Vietnamese and Vietic, there are retained native sets. So however much Vietnamese was influenced by Chinese, it has retained a complete set of native Austroasiatic Etyma. The yellow part is the Proto-Austroasiatic, true Proto-Austroasiatic numbers 1 through 4. 5 through 9 are connected to other Austroasiatic branches, somewhat later date. Okay, so I posit this retention of native numerals in Vietnamese demonstrates a feature of a socioculturally significant language in a community, despite the numerous other Chinese loanwords in Vietic and Vietnamese. Okay, the instance of Dai versus Vietnamese, it shows this kind of variation in what loanwords, how loanwords can be borrowed. And there are inferences to take from this, especially when combined with other topics. Okay, let's see here. Oh, and again, I'm making hypotheses based on a semantic domain, not just a single word. At this point, it becomes hard to argue that they are anything else. If I focus on one word, it can be chance similarity. But when I have a whole semantic domain and the phonological patterns match, it is pretty strong, strong evidence. Okay, for the last part of my talk, I'm going to talk about regional words in mainland Southeast Asia. And this is moving even further into the, it's not recent, but a little bit further into the Common Era, okay? Perhaps from the 1st to 2nd millennia CE. So they're connected to the era of the Southeast Asian kingdoms. So this is the Mon, Khmer, Thai, Dai really, and Chama kingdoms, okay? So mainland Southeast Asia, it's a region of shared linguistic features, words shared among language phyla, okay, with subregions within these. There are these regional words, sometimes called the Vantafote, the wandering words, words seen in multiple language families, sometimes without clear etymological source. And I'm going to look at words that are not well represented in the archaeological record. So in mainland Southeast Asia, headwear, woodwinds, boats, oars, and paddles. There is some, but not much. Okay. So I'm starting with headwear. Okay, word forms for headwear. I've seen no studies describing archaeological remnants of headwear in the BCE period or even early period. I would like to see some. I don't know. Textiles in mainland Southeast Asia are known to disintegrate in the, I guess it's acidic soil. That's what I've read in the archaeological literature. I don't know that aspect, but I know that that's what I've seen many times. Headwear is shown in the images in Damson bronze images from the BCE period. Fine. Images at Anchor in 1st millennium CE. That headwear is pretty decorative. I don't think that's daily wear. I would like to find more archaeological data. I can't find that much. So what does linguistic data show? Now, here's the way I'll present it. I'm going to show you these forms, and these forms contain words for headwear that I found in various databases, various language groups, and I use these all caps to approximate a loose phonological shape. It's not a reconstruction. You can't reconstruct one form for multiple language families, right? You can only do it within one group. So this is just a stand-in notational feature. The second column shows the Austroasiatic branches in which the forms are attested. Almost all are in mainland Southeast Asia proper, okay, not outside of mainland Southeast Asia. So it means they really can't date to Proto-Austroasiatic. They must be, or more likely to be, later developments. I don't think they were lost outside and retained here, but can't know. But that's when you see enough data, it starts to become clearer. The third column contains other languages that have comparable word forms, okay, like Old Chinese, Proto-Dai, Chamic, and such. Includes both reconstructions and modern languages. There are many implications of this data and a huge amount of historical linguistic information to unpack, but I don't have time. So based on this data, I make some hypotheses, right? Some tentative hypotheses. So the first two forms, the muk and mu, are from the same Old Chinese reconstruction form. Strange looking thing, something like muks. And a probable scenario is that the Old Chinese form, something like muk, was borrowed into Kradai. And that's what you have, this muk with the final K sound, when Chinese still had that final K. So it had to have been, an old enough period, because Chinese does not have that today. It's lost it. Much later, when the Dai groups expanded into mainland Southeast Asia, we have to assume that it spread into the region with them. Now, could it have been Chinese? Could it have been Dai? We cannot know that, but we know that this word spread, and probably potentially Tibeto-Burman as well. So it's just all over the place. It's all throughout the region, okay? There's a mu form without the K. This one is specific to Vietnamese, which does not have a K in its pronunciation, mu. And this S that's on there is evidence, matches the tone category. Okay, as I said, there's a lot to unpack. I can't go into details now, but this tone in Vietnamese is supported by large numbers of words in Proto-Austroasiatic and various. This is not a frivolous claim. Okay, there's a lot of support. So the word spread from Old Chinese into Vietic, from Vietic into neighboring Austroasiatic languages. Those, if you see there, the Mu, Bahnar, Katuic, Khmuic, Vietic, they are neighboring in Vietnam, basically. Okay, so there's another form, this clip form, I've recently noted. I label it possible, and I have to check for more data. The don, were listed conical. That is the iconic conical hat of Asia. This word is in Chamic, but it spread pretty far to the east in Austroasiatic. So considering some of the phonological features, and in both Khmer and Vietnamese, I think it's fairly old. And Charles Hyam shared with me an image of a conical hat on a Banchang bronze, perhaps from the mid-first century, mid-first millennium CE. So I've marked this as an Austroasiatic innovation. I don't know which group would have, but we can't know. It's a possibility. And then we have these other forms which show Indic contact as well. Okay. All right, now I'll go faster through the last few slides. I've got a few more I can cover. So woodwinds have a deep history among humans, and I know of only a little specific archaeological data. These objects deteriorate. I've seen them on Damson bronzes. Okay, Damson bronzes, people playing flutes, and we know that flutes have long history in human history in general. But at least those images of the Damson bronzes are something tangible to connect to. But let's look at the forms. So first, I list the Ken form. It's rather well known. I've not checked the ethnographic details carefully, but I think this is generally associated with Dai peoples, but it's spread into various languages in the region. So I've just taken the point of saying uncertain. I'd like to find more information. Now, there are several other words that I believe to be Austroasiatic innovations. Okay, the P or Pui forms and Khloe forms are both attested in Old Khmer texts. So this gives us another point of reference. So it's not just widespread in the words, it's in these texts before the second millennium and before the Dai expansion. So this suggests, and they're not elsewhere, suggests these are Austroasiatic innovations. Now I've highlighted Old Khmer, Old Mon, Old Khmer, and Monic. We will see that over and over again, where it seems like it's sort of the center of geographic center. I don't know which language innovated it, but I'm going to simply say Old Khmer is the geographic center, Monic as the geographic center. Okay, that's the approach. Another Indic word, possible Hindi source, probably more recent, and I'm not going to talk about that. For boats, I think boats in the first millennium CE, the so-called Bayue peoples are listed as having boats in Chinese texts, and there's the archaeological descriptions of boats used as coffins, that sort of thing. Okay, fine. I can't find a Proto-Austroasiatic word for boat. It's very frustrating. That's the way it is. If you can't find it, you can't find it. There is no deep history. Instead, there are these widespread words for boats, but only inside mainland Southeast Asia, not outside. So these are most likely innovations. Again, we see Khmeric and Monic or Old Mon as the center, geographic center of these. There is a fairly widespread loanword into the Austroasiatic languages, and it seems to be most likely a probable Dai source. The Proto-Dai reconstruction is more complicated. The words in the Austroasiatic ones are simpler, so it looks like this spread. Let's see here. Again, no precise information. We need more ethnohistorical information. Last, forms for oars and paddling here. This form after boats, we have paddles, right? This form is very provocative, but there is insufficient, inconsistent data, so I'd list it uncertain. But yet again, we see some words that are in have as their geographic center either Old Khmer or Khmeric, modern languages. And it looks like something happened, and I don't know what these different oars were, what kind of paddles they were. I would like to see ethnographic data. It's not easy to get that. Okay, I've got this data. I've got questions I'd like to answer. Okay, please help me. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up, summarizing what I presented, and I'll give some last thoughts. So the linguistic data, as per Austroasiatic reconstructions, supports these archaeological studies, is the spread of Neolithic agriculturalists in mainland Southeast Asia, 4000 BP. That's general, it does. Proto-Vietic reconstructed terms for rice production and processing suggest practices in northern Vietnam centuries before the Han expansion. Okay, that's my, giving my chronological perspective on it. In the first millennium CE, the Monic and Khmeric speaking kingdoms appear to have spread words for woodwind instruments and oars. Other semantic domains will undoubtedly pattern this way. Both Dai and specifically the Dai groups and Vietnamese were conduits. They shared Chinese words with Austroasiatic languages, of which hat is only one example. Thought. Historical lexical data can have ethnohistorical implications and or raise specific questions that the historical archaeological record alone cannot. That's what I presented some of these. I raised questions, don't know the answers. Finally, broadly speaking, in mapping areas here, modern language data and proto-language reconstructions show a geographic range of cultural domains of words, similar to ways one can map archaeological findings and historical descriptions. Okay, I didn't map these out for you, but in my mind, I know where these words are, where the languages are spoken. Supporting linguistic research, lexical data must be checked against archaeohistorical information to test and refine hypotheses about ethnohistorical linguistic matters, but we could support archaeology and history. Despite the various limits and caveats, as linguistic data includes concepts and intangible culture, it can fill in historical gaps in historical texts or archaeological data. Linguistic data also raises questions that might not otherwise be asked and can lead to new research paths in human history. So I have talked quite a lot, and I've given you a lot of information. Feel free to share some comments or ask some questions.